Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. We're excited to share the results from a recent survey of our students. We're planning to transfer and how COVID affected their journeys. So we're going to get started. I'm Darla Cooper. I'm with the RP group. If you're not familiar with us, we are an independent nonprofit that works with the California Community College system, and we are the representative organization for the researchers and planners who work in our colleges across the system. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Katie Brohan. Say hi, Katie.
Hi, everyone.
All right, let's go to the next slide. So we're going to start today's presentation with just a very brief overview of Through the Gate. I know some of you may be familiar with it, and maybe you could even give this part of the presentation. But for anyone who is not already familiar, we thought we'd want to make sure everybody at least has that basic information. Let's go to the next slide. So Through the Gate is a study that we wanted to look at students who had met most, if not all, of their transfer requirements, but had not transferred, to try to see if we could uncover what might be behind their reasons for not transferring and what we might be able to do about it at the different levels, at an institutional level, a programmatic level, individual level, and obviously system level. So the study consisted of two primary phases. The first phase was to just kind of map the landscape. We just had the basic question of, okay, we think there's this group of students out there. How many are we talking? Who are they? Where are they? Things like that. In doing this work, what we learned is that transfer, it's not a simple dichotomy, either transfer or you don't, that there's a journey that students are on to get to transfer. And so we came up with this transfer continuum. And very briefly, it starts, if we start with me at the top, we have our transfer achievers, which is the person in yellow who is beyond the gate. And we use the metaphor of the gate as transfer. And then the next person in green represents students who are at the gate, students who have either earned an ADT or they've completed at least 60 transferable units with a 2.0 and have completed both their transfer English and math requirements, but have not transferred. Then we have the next group of students who we call near the gate. And the main difference between at the gate and near the gate is the completion of transfer English or math. So again, they still have the same 60 transferable units with a 2.0, but they have not completed English and math. They may have completed one or the other, but they have not completed both, or maybe they've completed neither. And so our study really focuses on those three groups. Again, we also refer to them as our high leverage students, in terms of they're very, very close and worth some attention in terms of how do we get them through that gate. But we did want to recognize that there's a lot of other students who aren't in those categories, who haven't made it to that high leverage group. The first one there in blue is our momentum students. And these were just students that we just wanted to recognize them and kind of separate them out to say these students have momentum. They've achieved at least 45, but not 60 transferable units with a 2.0. So they have momentum towards transfer, but they have not met even the baseline requirements of that. And then actually the largest group in the entire study was our transfer explorers. And these are students who completed somewhere between 12 and 44 or less than 45 transferable units over a 6-year period. So these are people who have been in the system for 6 years, had accumulated some amount of transferable units, but had not transferred. Right. Let's go to our next slide, please. So again, very briefly, what we found, there were lots of findings, of course, but some of the very key findings from that first phase was that a lot of the students in the at the gate and the near the gate group had stopped attending. And of those students, more than half didn't have any kind of credential. They had no degree, no certificate. And so if they don't transfer, they may be at a disadvantage by not having any kind of credential on their record. Again, at the time of this study, we were looking at students, I believe, between 2010 and 2015 and their progress through, I want to say 17 or 18. What we found is kind of, my point being, it's pre-AB 705. So math was a major barrier, and especially when we looked at our near the gate students, 92% of them had not completed their math requirement. Another finding key here is this time is the enemy, in that we looked at from the point where a student becomes or meets the criteria for near the gate, how long before they transferred. So again, looking at the students who did transfer. And what we found was that the vast majority of students transfer within 1 year. So the implication is if you don't, your chance of transferring is highest if they do it if you do it in your first year after meeting those near the gate requirements. And what we saw in the data was that after a year, the number kind of fell off a cliff, and students became much less likely to transfer 2, 3, 4, 5 years out. The next finding is one that we really want to highlight, which is when we just look at again, that high leverage group, the at the gate, near the gate, and transfer achievers, and we disaggregate by race, what we find is that African Americans were the most likely to transfer in that group. They had the highest transfer rate compared to all other ethnic groups. The problem is they were among the least likely to make it to the high leverage group to meet all or most of their transfer requirements. And that is why hopefully in the next few months or so, you will be hearing about a new study that we're doing called the African American Tipping Point, where we are going to investigate this finding in more detail to figure out what is it that is changing African American students' odds of going from very not likely to be most likely to transfer. So stay tuned for that. And then finally, when we broke these out by race ethnicity, what we found is our Latinx, our Hispanic students were more likely than other groups to be at or near the gate than to have transferred. So after all of that information, we had a better sense of who and where and what, but not how and why. And when we shared the phase 1 findings, that was the biggest question we got. But why? Why aren't they transferring? They said, that's a very good question. And that's phase 2. So during phase 2, we went and found these students, these at and near the gate students, and we asked them in a very polite way, why haven't you transferred? And their answers to us came back and it helped us create this student transfer capacity building framework, because their answers really kind of were categorized into these 4 different factors. And I will just go over them very briefly for you. The number 1 factor, which cut across all students, race, gender, you name the factor, we did not find very many differences. Top of their list in terms of challenges to transferring, university affordability. And it's not just the actual ability to afford the university, but not having any understanding of whether they could afford it, to not having a true understanding of how much it really costs and what kind of assistance is available to pay for college. And the example I like to use here is if you're a community college student and you are looking at the aid that is available to you at the community college, the type of aid, the amount of aid, the proportion kind of thing, and then you apply that to what it costs at the university, I can see how a student would go, I can't afford it. If I'm going to get the comparable aid, at the university, I'm not going to be able to pay for housing, food, books, etc. So we need to do a better job of making this a reality for students, helping them understand what is available and making the university affordable in their perceptions, right? For them to understand how this is affordable. So going clockwise, pathway navigation is very simply, making sure that students have the information they need to make the choices that they need to make when they need to make them about transfer, about taking courses, about applying, about, all of the things that you need to know and therefore do to transfer successfully. So it's navigating that path. And I think we've all heard the different stories, and may have even been your story, of the difficulty of knowing which courses am I supposed to take for which colleges, for which majors, at which time, and what else do I need to do in addition to taking courses that will get me to my goal. Going around school life balance, you will hear how that was affected during COVID. I think you might think some obvious things there, but it's just really looking at what our role is in terms of easing, knowing our students and knowing the challenges that they have of trying to balance school with their life, their lives, they're working, they have family obligations. There's all different kinds of things that our students, their basic needs, all of those things kind of factor into it. And we need to look at our role to determine, are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? Are we helping or are we hurting? In terms of, are we trying to make it easy or make it hard? So that's what that one comes down to. And last here is support network. And it's just the importance of having people around you to support you in a variety of ways. So that entails, people who are the cheerleaders, who just tell you, I believe in you, you can do this, to the people who help you do it. The counselor who, walks you through, sits down with you, helps you pick a transfer institution, helps you understand financial aid, instructors who give you recommendations about the best programs for your major, all of those things, and all different kind of roles in between. Students need that support, and again, a variety of different types of support from different people in different roles, in and out of the colleges, to help them. And what we heard was how important that was from the students who had it, and also from the students who didn't have it. Okay, next slide, please. So again, just very quickly, some of the high level findings from, again, lots more than what's here. It's already said that finances, university affordability is the biggest hurdle. They're juggling a lot of competing interests. They are missing accurate and timely. It's not just about accuracy, but timely information. I can't tell how many students tell you, I wish I had known earlier. I found out too late, kind of thing. But making sure that we're getting the information to them that they need when they need it. And then, as I mentioned, just not having that social support, that support network does impact their ability to, or I would say their transfer capacity. And so I think that's it for me. Next slide. Nope, there's more. So I forgot about the disaggregation. My apologies. So again, this is just a very high level few summary items that we found when we disaggregated, looking at the factors by race, and we looked at other factors, but just sharing some quick highlights with you. Our Hispanic, Latinx students were more likely than their Asian and white counterparts to report that having universities close to home are very important to them, highly motivating. Same group of students were more likely than the Asian and white counterparts to indicate university tuition or to see it as challenging and affecting their ability to transfer. And then finally, our African American and Black students were more likely than white students to use the different transfer related resources and to find them helpful, which for me, the indications of these are, the first one is, what opportunities are we giving students who cannot move? Right? They are place bound in some way. What are their options? Especially if they live in maybe a more rural area where there aren't a lot of university options. What else? How else do we make transfer available to them? The second one is, I've already mentioned, how do we get students, while they're still in community college, much more information about university affordability to make that a reality, make that seem like a reality for them, a choice that is open to them. And then finally, we need to make sure that we are helping our African American Black students connect with the resources, because if they are aware of them, they use them and they find them helpful. Now I think it's where I hand it off. Thank you.
So phase 2 that Darla was just referencing wrapped literally just as the pandemic hit. We had just put out the report, and all of the factors that Darla mentioned in the framework were all challenges students were facing before the pandemic. But as the pandemic hit, we started to wonder, how is this going to impact transfer broadly? Are we going to see changes in the trajectories of high leverage students as a result of the pandemic? Will we see existing equity gaps widen more than ever before? And then, not to just focus on the negative, we started to wonder what new or different supports might transfer motivated students need in these coming years, and how can we get out ahead of that and really find them the supports that they're going to need in the aftermath of the pandemic. But these really are longer term questions. And so to develop a nearer term understanding of the pandemic's impact specifically for these high leverage learners and to prime future research related to increasing transfer success, we needed to answer some more immediate questions. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And there really were 4 core questions that we needed to answer. You see 2 of them here. The first is, how are students' transfer plans affected by the pandemic? The second is, what issues did students who were close to transfer face during the pandemic? And then the third is, what did students know about changes in both the California Community College and university segments designed to support their transfer journey, and how did they leverage these changes? And I want to pause here for a second to make sure everyone's on the same page about what I'm talking about here. When the pandemic hit, both the California Community College system as well as the California State University system and the University of California system, UC system, they temporarily adjusted their transfer requirements in an attempt to support transfer motivated students. They also made a number of other changes not designed specifically for transfer students, but would definitely support them. And some of these changes, for example, are the ability to select pass, no pass for a course at any time during the term. Students could also retake any course attempted during the pandemic without penalty, so it wouldn't factor into their GPA. Also, students were able to take an excused withdrawal, sometimes called an EW, which is considered non-enrollment. And again, it doesn't penalize the student in terms of the GPA because you need a certain GPA to transfer. And all of these changes sought to ensure that the community college students could continue to make progress towards their ultimately receiving their bachelor's degree and stem any declines in transfer. So going back to this third question, we really wanted to look at, did students know about these changes? And if they did, how did they leverage them? And then last but certainly not least, we wanted to really dig into the framework Darla was talking about. We wanted to look at how are those 4 factors from the transfer capacity building framework showing up in students' transfer experience. And because I mentioned previously that we've seen, rather Darla mentioned previously, that we've seen differences before in how different student groups experienced each of these 4 factors, we wanted to dig in and see if students were differentially impacted in each of these areas as a result of the pandemic. So that is what we did. So to give you just a brief overview of what the methodology looked like, we wound up getting survey responses from nearly 8,000 students. What we did was we asked colleges to send this survey out to students at the college who were identified as having completed at least 45 transferable units as of spring 2020 or fall 2020. So again, we received nearly 8,000 responses from 67% of the 67 of the California community colleges. It's over half of them. And then in addition to this, once the survey wrapped up, we conducted 2 focus groups. One focus group was with students who were able to successfully transfer over the course of the pandemic. And the other was with a group of students who indicated on the survey that their transfer experience had been significantly impacted during the pandemic. And so what we'll share today are predominantly the survey results, but these focus groups allowed us to get a little more detail and a little more nuanced into some of the responses that we were seeing. So let's dive in to what we found. So as a reminder, that first research question was, how were students' transfer plans affected by the pandemic? Many students surveyed indicated that the pandemic negatively affected their transfer plans, despite the fact that they'd already made considerable progress towards transfer. These impacts ranged from putting their transfer plans on hold to dropping out entirely. A lot of students, perhaps not surprisingly, noted deferrals and not wanting to pay university tuition if they thought it was going to be an online experience, and wanting to wait until life got what they call back to normal before they went forward with transferring to university. The student groups that were most likely to indicate having changed their transfer plans included students of non-binary gender, Native American and Alaska Native students, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander students, and then it's not mentioned here, but students ages 18 to 25. Now for me, in this area, perhaps most startling was the finding that some students said that the pandemic totally derailed their plans, even after they had been admitted to university. So nearly 1 in 10 students had not only applied to transfer, but they'd been accepted to transfer and decided not to go. And now some of these were deferrals, but we don't actually know if they're ever going to make it back on track. So that's something we need to keep a close eye on in these coming years. Now, that second research question again was, what issues did students face who were close to transfer during the pandemic? Well, many of them reported difficulty accessing transfer-related resources during the pandemic, both at the community college level as well as on the university side, such as access to counselors and advisors. 40% of students found it harder to access the counselors and advisors, and 33% of students found it difficult to access transfer center staff, both again, at the community college side and on the university side. And what I found especially interesting, and this came out of the focus groups, was that among these students in the focus group, some of them expressed concern about whether they'd be prepared for university. It was actually pretty interesting in light of the third research question, which I'll talk about in a second, but some of these students said that they were actually worried that the leniency that was allowed in COVID, basically to cut students a break in such a trying time, made them nervous that when they transferred to university, they wouldn't actually be prepared. And this was especially true of students who had a lot of hands-on coursework like sciences, nursing, and even art. But sticking with this idea of trying to make things easier, like I mentioned before, both the California Community College system as well as the universities, the CSUs and the UCs, made changes in an attempt to kind of make things a little bit easier during such a difficult time. And we wanted to know, were students aware of these changes? And if they were they able to leverage them positively? And we had this hypothesis about how these great changes would have the potential to do great things. And we might even recommend that they be instilled even after the pandemic is over. But to me, what was fascinating was that more than 2/3 of students didn't even know about these changes. 68% of students didn't know about changes on the community college side, and 75% didn't know about the changes on the university side. And then even when we asked those who did know about the changes, granted it was a relatively small proportion, they said that it didn't really impact them all that much. They didn't have to leverage those changes. That said, and this is where I feel like adding the information from the focus groups was really important. When we did let students know about these changes and kind of reflect on them, many of them said, yeah, I didn't know about that, or I didn't use that, but it would be nice to know it existed, because in such stressful, trying times, just knowing that they had some sort of a safety net there if they did need to use it was actually really well received. So, okay. Now, last but certainly not least, the research brief that is coming out later this week explores in great detail the question, how are the 4 factors from the student transfer capacity building framework currently impacting students' transfer experiences? So I'm going to walk you through this slide. We asked students the degree to which they believed each of the 4 factors in the framework was a challenge to them before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and as they looked ahead to the coming year. Now, that's the year we're in right now. And what you're going to see on the slide, these percentages are the percent of students who indicated a given factor as very challenging. So on a 1 to 4 point scale, they rated it a 4. Okay. So here you can see before the pandemic, we have 33% of students indicating that university affordability is a challenge or was a challenge before the pandemic. 25% indicated school life balance as a challenge, 19% for pathway navigation, and 15% for support network. And if you look back at the phase 2 findings, this actually is pretty well aligned with what we saw there. Then we asked them, how much were each of these things a challenge during the pandemic? Perhaps not surprisingly, we saw a huge rise in all 4 of these factors. And they kind of maintained their position relative to one another. But as you can see, for school life balance, the proportion of students indicating that school life balance was a challenge rose almost up to meet the proportion of students who indicated that university affordability was a challenge. But given that this was administered, the survey was administered in March and April, we asked students to look ahead to the coming year. Now, granted, we had different thoughts about what this current year would look like in March and April than what is the reality now. So just it's important to keep that in mind. But as students were looking ahead to the coming year, we saw some interesting patterns. So two things that I really want to point out here. There's a lot to unpack here, but two things I want to point out. University affordability is of increasing concern as students consider transfer. In fact, it's the only one of the 4 factors where students don't see it becoming less of a challenge as they look ahead to the coming year. They're worried about paying for their education. And this has only increased since before to during to now as they look ahead. And then second, I want to point out that students are still worried about school life balance at a very high rate. And as I mentioned before, it showed the steepest rise from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. And while it is kind of trending back downward now, the proportion of students continuing to express this concern is notable, right? Okay, so I mentioned before, and Darla mentioned actually that in the original phase 2 study, we looked at some group differences in the relative challenge and actually the motivation as well of each of the 4 factors. And so we did that again here. This is just going to be a snapshot. And I will say for those who kind of like to nerd out over data, we have the research brief coming out about this project, but we also have a very detailed technical report so you can really dive into all of these findings. So this is just going to give you a high level overview of some of the differences we saw in what I'm calling the challenge trajectories. That is, what that line looked like for any given student group. So for university affordability, we saw that it remains especially challenging for Latinx, Middle Eastern, female, non-binary, first generation, and older students. And here I mean students ages 50 and up. When it came to school life balance, students ages 26 and up found this to be especially challenging. Female and non-binary students saw this to be substantially more challenging than before the pandemic. And also Middle Eastern students saw a sharp increase in the degree to which school life balance really challenged their transfer progress. When it came to pathway navigation, we found an interesting finding that East Asian students found navigating transfer pathways to be increasingly challenging. And so if you remember the previous slide where you actually saw, a steep rise from before to during the pandemic and then trending back downwards relatively quickly. While that wasn't the case for East Asian students, they actually continue to trend upward in terms of the percent of students who indicated this was a challenge. So it'll be important to pay attention to the student group as the pandemic wanes. And then lastly, with respect to support network, I'm going to show this in more detail in a later slide, but we saw that the gap in the proportion of first generation compared to non-first generation students indicating that this was a challenge grew from before the pandemic to as they look ahead to the coming year. All right, and I just want to dig in a little deeper to each of these 4 factors to give you a better sense of what we saw. So again, as I mentioned before, university affordability was the only one of the 4 factors that continued overall to show a rise in the proportion of students indicating that it was a challenge. In the words of one student, they said, "The uncertainty as to how next year will be is what's causing me the most stress. I'm currently working at a warehouse to afford food and pay bills, but I work graveyard shift. Not knowing if school will be back in person really stresses me out because I'm unsure whether to find a new job that will fit my future schedule or keep the one I have at the moment." And here again, this is just a snapshot of one of the many findings, but when we broke out again, what I'm calling the challenge trajectories by race and ethnicity, we found that Latinx students are the most likely to indicate the challenge of university affordability. So before the pandemic, African-American and Black students were most likely to indicate this challenge. And now it is Latinx students, and they saw a pretty substantial rise over the course of the pandemic. Then if we turn to school life balance, Again, this one saw a substantial rise overall from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. And it is trending back downward, but not at the same rate as the other factors. And as one student noted, if everything will be closed, my son will not be able to go to school. I will not be able to work, and it will affect deeply my financial situation. Also, I will have problems studying because my son, who wants my attention all day long, will be always around me, and I will have to teach him myself when in fact I am not a teacher and I don't know how to teach. Now, as someone who had a third grader at home all year last year, that really resonated with me. I am not a teacher. And, of course, in the main report, we have this broken out by gender as well. But when we broke it out by age, we found a pretty interesting pattern. And so here you can see that among students ages 18 to 25, they saw a really steep rise in the challenge of school-life balance from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. But as they were looking ahead to the coming year, it was trending back downward. But for students ages 26 to 49, it's actually higher than it ever has been before. So that's something that'll be important to pay attention to. Now, pathway navigation. So just a reminder, both this and support network kind of rose and are trending back downward at the quickest rate, but they're still important. As one student noted, I was admitted to a UC for fall 2020, but the UC withdrew my admission on the day of class registration, saying I had to complete one more subject. I was communicating with them and had informed them because of COVID, office visits were not allowed, phones were off, and I could not get a counselor to help me register for the class. I couldn't take the class. I had explained this scenario to the UC, and they were okay until the day I needed to register for my classes. They had me withdraw my application. My dream was crushed into a million pieces. And so we heard a lot of this with respect to students thinking that they were on the right path, thinking they were doing what they needed to do in spite of different hurdles they might have faced, only to find out pretty late in the game that that wasn't the case. Oops. Okay, now I mentioned this before. So I think it's important to point out that if you look at this figure, which is showing in purple the challenge trajectories of first generation students, and then in orange, the challenge trajectories of non-first generation students, in general, across all four of the factors, you see a relatively similar pattern here. You see that across the entire time span, first generation students are more likely to indicate the challenge of a given factor than non-first generation students. But the reason I put it here under pathway navigation is because I was looking at the gap in the degree of challenge from before the pandemic to looking ahead to this upcoming year. And here you can see that before the pandemic, there was a relatively small gap between these two groups in the proportion indicating that pathway navigation was a challenge. And now that gap is growing. So it'll be really important to pay attention to supporting first generation students with respect to pathway navigation as we look ahead. And then lastly, with respect to accessing a support network. Again, this followed a similar trajectory to pathway navigation, but in the words of a student, they said, it's become harder to find support from friends and family to keep going. It seems more reasonable to stop trying and go back to school, stop trying to go back to school to pursue my interest and to find reasonable full-time work instead. Especially with myself and everyone having struggled with the pandemic, there is little support for doing something like school when working is so important right now. And this came up a lot. This was just really representative of that. And then another one where I'm breaking it down by age because there was a pretty interesting pattern here. Again, we saw that everyone saw an increase in the challenge of accessing a support network from before to during the pandemic. And this goes back to what I mentioned about issues that students referenced accessing advisors, transfer counselors, transfer directors during the pandemic. But what you see is students ages 26 and up, or sorry, rather 49 and younger, things are kind of trending back downward a little more quickly. Whereas for students ages 50 and higher, this is still a challenge. It's almost as challenging as they look ahead to the coming year. Again, that's the year we're in now, as it was during the pandemic. So it'll be important to pay attention to supporting these older students as well. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Darla to talk about now what? What do we do with these findings?
Thank you, Katie. Good stuff. So I think, what we're hoping with doing this study, sharing these results, is that colleges will put more emphasis perhaps on getting students back on track, going out, reaching out, identifying, finding these students and reaching out and saying, how can we help you? What do you need? And we may not be able to meet all their needs, but you definitely can't meet them if you don't know what they are. So reaching out to them, making sure that as a lot of colleges do continue to be mostly online, both in the classroom and in student services, making sure students are aware of and have access to all the transfer resources, and working with the universities to make sure that their resources are being made available. One thing we may want to consider, especially for my fellow researchers out there and my faculty colleagues, how did learning outcomes, how were they affected during the pandemic? This speaks specifically to that finding we shared about students' concerns about the rigor. And it's kind of that catch-22, right? They appreciate the leniency. We heard that came through loud and clear. They appreciate the accommodations, the compassion, the empathy that faculty showed during this very, very difficult time. But on the other hand, am I still going to be prepared to cut it at the university because of, how did this last year of leniency, of compassion, of all of these things, of relaxation help or hurt my ability to succeed at that level? I think we do as a system, both UC, CSU, and us as California Community College System, we need to be looking at the changes that were made in response to the pandemic, and see which ones may need to be continued just because they're good practice, not because of the pandemic, but because they really help students. Did it really help students? And making sure that students are aware of the changes that have been made and are being maintained or will be made. Because as you saw, went through all this effort, but if nobody knows about it, what good is it, quite frankly? And then this is kind of this last one is a point that we've made through our Through the Gate study, which is students are whole people. We need to be much more holistic in how we approach and supporting them regarding to transfer. We need to look at integration wherever possible, because students don't operate in this siloed, way. They need us to be much more, again, holistic in our approach to them, and also integrated to make it as easy as possible for them throughout their entire journey. Next slide, please. So what might that look like? What might holistic and integrated support look like? And I'm not going to read all of these, but what you will find are sections like this throughout the guide that talks about, or the brief that talks about what the community colleges could do on their side, but also pointing out what UC and CSU can do, and especially us, all three entities working together for the benefit of students. But just taking the first one there, look at these factors, these 4 factors from the transfer capacity building framework. Looking at retention. What is the connection between that? Looking at student success, both at the course level, but also kind of in a progression, degree completion, transfer level. And then make sure that you're disaggregating that data to see if different groups are having different experiences and or successes. And then in terms of the 3 systems working together, cannot say enough. So much work needs to be done together to make sure that students understand what it costs, not just tuition, but what is the total cost of attending the university, and how they can get help. What kind of help, where to get it from, whether that's obviously filling out the FAFSA, but there's scholarships, there's work study, there's all kinds of resources that are available to students at the university that are not available at the community college level, unfortunately. But students need to know that, to understand that with that big price increase comes an increase in the assistance that's available. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is just a quote from one of our survey participants that we thought we wanted to share because we think it just kind of sums it up, and we couldn't say it better ourselves, but I will read this to you. There is no precedent for this type of ordeal that we are going through, so no one has the authority nor answers on how life will continue or go back to quote unquote normal after this. And because of it, every day will be a continuous unknown and could possibly be another hindrance to progression. The student is reminding us, not that we didn't know, but I think the student just so eloquently put it, we don't know, but that's no excuse for not trying. And sometimes we may get it wrong, but let's look at why it may not have been the best solution and what we can do to improve. But we need to make sure that we are all taking this into account. Next slide, please. So just want to briefly share with you some of the resources that we have produced related to Through the Gate recently. So the first one, the big one, is the one that Katie referenced that was coming out, I believe Friday. Is it Friday or tomorrow coming out? And then the other two resources are guides, because as we've grown over the years as an organization in terms of our research, we realize that it is just not sufficient to provide the research, and people just have to figure it out. Have to figure out on their own what they're supposed to do with that. So we work with partner organizations when appropriate to say, how do we make these results applicable to your colleagues? So the first one there is Transfer Leaders Speak, and there's a webinar on the 20th. We invite you, if you haven't already signed up for that, please do. Where we will hear from transfer leaders along with transfer students in terms of their experiences related to COVID, again, from both sides, and trying to support the students and then the students being supported. But that guide will be released at that time. I believe that's correct. And mark your calendars, 2 weeks from today, same time, well, not the same place, technically, it's a different link, but you get the point. And then the third resource there is our one that speaks directly to university affordability. And it's we worked in partnership with the chief student services officers because it wasn't just financial aid people's job to help with this. And so we wanted to emphasize that all kinds of student services professionals can help with this, both again at the community college and at the university level. So that one is already on our website, I believe. No, yes, somebody tell me. Oh, yes, I'm supposed to mention. Go ahead.
I believe it is up there already, yeah.
Okay. And that there's going to be another resource released later this month. There's not a picture up here yet. But we are working on something. This is an area that we've talked about and tried to stick our toe in the water with, but producing and taking some of our research and making it digestible for students. What about this information it would be helpful for students? So we are partnering with the statewide student senate to produce a resource that will hopefully be designed again, with the student in mind, not just the information, but also looking at delivery, because producing something like this may work for us, but we don't know. We have to look at how do we package the information so that students will click on it, open it. How do we do that? So that's something that we're venturing into and we're very hopeful about. So lots of information, lots of resources are coming out. So I think
and I'll just add one that we didn't put on here because it doesn't have as beautiful and flashy a cover page, but I think I referenced earlier when I was speaking that this research brief, the one you're seeing here on the top left, is accompanied by a very lengthy technical report. And so that will be released alongside the research brief. And it really dives deep into all of the different student group challenge trajectories that we saw. So it's worth a read alongside a more condensed version too.
Thank you. So I also want to give a shout out to Kelly, who's a major player, partner with us on this project. She's putting links in the chat for us. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you also, I think that was Michael, no, Paul. I said something from Michael. Maybe I'm just going too fast. Thank you, Paul. We really appreciate your feedback. I think we may have a survey. Do we have a survey that we want to also have?
I think we're going to be we'll send that out.
Okay. So when you get the email that hopefully has the link to the brief and the report, that you will please fill out the survey and let us know. So we do have some time for questions. I think there was one in the Q&A that I answered. Hopefully that was sufficient, but I think most of your answers will be in that technical report, because again, we could, if you see the length of the technical report, you would realize this would be like a 4-hour webinar if we went through all the different findings. So we please invite you to look at that, to maybe look for a particular student group that you're interested in seeing. How did that shake out in terms of those 4 factors and their challenge trajectory? I like that language. So I'm trying to look to see if there are any questions in the chat. Thank you, Terrence. Nice to, I can't see you, but nice to know that you're here. And again, thanks to Kelly. Oh, there's something in the chat. I think that we put it in there. There's another resource we didn't put on the picture, but it was a guide that was probably, I think it was the first one we produced, which we partnered with Academic Senate, statewide Academic Senate on, which was speaking specifically to faculty, mostly classroom faculty, in terms of what they can do both as an individual and also like in their department or their program to help students transfer, and really trying to elevate that. You know, I think a lot of times people think that helping students transfer is a student services job. It's a counselor's job, an advisor's job, a transfer center director's job, and that faculty don't have, you know, a clear role to play in that. And so we hope that this guide will help faculty see how there are some very, even small things that they can do to help students transfer. Quite frankly, transfer is complicated. So that means there's lots of opportunities to help.
Yeah. And I just want to put in another plug for the event on the 20th, and just a little quick background. Originally, the interviews with the transfer center directors were supposed to be all part of this, the study we talked about today. So it was going to be the survey and the focus groups and the interviews. These interviews were so rich and robust with these 5 transfer center directors that we had to rethink the whole thing and realize it needed its own resource. It needed its own webinar. These were transfer center directors where the students on the survey said they were incredibly successful in helping them navigate transfer during the pandemic. And so Kelly, who's putting these links into the chat, was such an integral part of this piece of the work. And I think it's going to be just amazing, both having a subset of those 5 transfer center directors there to hear from them, as well as students themselves. So, you know, not to sound like a used car salesman, but I think it's going to be a pretty great webinar in 2 weeks. And it's a great resource too.
Thank you, Paulina. We appreciate that. And I think that my screen's cutting it off. Right, any questions, comments? Thank you. Happy to end early. Well, if you think of something later, feel free to reach out to Katie or myself. We're happy to engage. And again, our purpose with all the research that we do, not just this study, but any study, is usefulness. We don't do research for research's sake. We do it to help students. And our way to help students is to help our colleagues who serve students, who program for students, who administer for students, giving them the information that we think might be helpful in fulfilling that duty. So thank you all.
I'm going to say one last thing before we lose everyone that we should have said at the start. This work was not possible without the support of both the ECMC Foundation and College Futures Foundation. College Futures Foundation has been a partner in this work since its inception, and ECMC specifically for this project came in to support it. And both of them, you know, yes, they're funders and that's fantastic, but perhaps most importantly, they've been amazing thought partners. I look forward to every conversation we have with them. And so we are super, super thankful for that support. Thank you so much, everyone. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day.